Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Job Accommodations, Putting Veterans with Disabilities to Work. Thank you for joining us. My name is Maddie Goldstein. I am the Program Assistant at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, and together with our partners from Advocates for Human Potential, we make up the National Veterans Technical Assistance Center. Before we get underway with the webinar, I'd like to go over a few logistics. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for you to access about 24 hours after it's over. If you are having technical difficulties, you can communicate with me via the chat box or find my email address on any of the webinar registration emails you received. All of your participant lines are muted, so you will be unable to ask questions over the phone. But on the GoToWebinar dashboard, please find the Questions tab where you can submit your questions, and we will leave time at the end for a Q&A. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the recording, the slides, and a post-webinar survey. This survey will also pop up immediately after the call, the webinar today, and we would appreciate it if you just took a minute to complete the survey to help us stay informed, and we can continue to bring you the voices and information relevant to your work with veterans. I am pleased to introduce today's guest, Melanie Wetzel from the Job Accommodations Network. Melanie joined the JAN staff as a consultant on the cognitive neurological team in February 2008. She has a 14-year history of teaching and advocating for students with disabilities in the public school system. Melanie holds a Master of Arts degree in Special Education, a Bachelor of Arts degree in English, and most recently completed a graduate certification in career planning and placement for youth in transition. As a member of the cognitive neurological team, Melanie specializes in learning disabilities, mental impairments, developmental disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, and brain injuries. She became a certified brain injury specialist in December 2014. Melanie, thank you again for being with us, and I am turning the webinar controls over to you.
All right, thank you. We'll get started here. Glad to be here and participate in this. All right, so we're first going to talk about JAN. The Job Accommodation Network, better known as JAN, is the leading source of free, expert, and confidential guidance on workplace accommodations and disability employment issues. Working towards practical solutions that benefit both the employer and the employee, JAN helps people with disabilities enhance their employability and shows employers how to capitalize on the value and talent that people with disabilities add to the workplace. Consultants offer one-on-one guidance on workplace accommodations, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and related legislation such as the Rehabilitation Act. We also provide information on self-employment and entrepreneurship options for people with disabilities. The ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. The Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, in programs receiving federal financial assistance, in federal employment, and in the employment practices of federal contractors. Now, just a bit more information for those of you who may not be as familiar with JAN and what we do. JAN was established in 1983 as a free national service and continues to function that same way today. Even though we are a national service, we're located on the beautiful campus of West Virginia University. We specialize in job accommodations and the employment provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Consultants can assist callers at any point in the interactive process, from explaining what the process includes to helping pinpoint and solve difficulties at specific steps. We can answer specific questions and give targeted technical assistance. We also provide comprehensive resources. All calls are confidential, so callers can freely explore their options. There are numerous ways to contact us. You can communicate using the telephone. We have a live chat. You can text. There's TTY, relay, email, and social networks. We offer live and archive training just like this that you're receiving today through this webinar, and we work as your partner in the employment and retention of employees with disabilities. Consultants at JAN answer questions and offer assistance to employers, individuals, service providers, and others, including a parent who might call with questions about a son or daughter, an adult child calling for ways to assist a parent, other family members, union representatives, as well as medical professionals, educational professionals, and attorneys. I even had a call several weeks ago from a woman who was calling to assist her neighbor. Consultants at JAN specialize in specific areas and work on teams. When you call, you'll speak to a program assistant who will direct you to the appropriate team and team member for the particular disability and situation you're calling for assistance with. The motor team assists callers with disabilities such as back, neck, shoulder, and leg impairments, as well as other mobility issues, arthritis, heart conditions, and multiple sclerosis. The sensory team works with individuals who have hearing, vision, and speech impairments, as well as allergies, asthma, and other respiratory impairments. The cognitive neurological team consults with callers on mental health impairments such as depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, and panic disorders, as well as learning and intellectual disabilities, traumatic brain injuries, attention deficit disorders, autism spectrum disorders, and epilepsy. And our entrepreneurship team assists those callers who need information and resources on small business and self-employment options. Okay, here you see a screenshot of our homepage. I'd like to go into a little bit more detail concerning a few features here that you will find most useful. In the menu at the top of the page, see the tabs for the ADA Library, Publications and Resources, Searchable Accommodations Database, and the A to Z of Disabilities and Accommodations. And those are the ones that we're going to talk about. The ADA Library contains more information than you'll probably ever need, but for a really thorough explanation of the definition of disability under the ADA, with good examples and tips, try reading our JAN publication. It's the first one listed. Under Publications and Resources, you'll find JAN publications in Spanish, as well as a comprehensive list of all JAN publications. And let me just warn you, it's a very big list. You'll also be able to locate federal, state, and local resources, as well as legal resources and additional websites with disability resources. Now let's look at SOAR, our Searchable Online Accommodation Resource. SOAR allows you to explore various accommodation options. It may not answer all of your questions, but it's a really good place to start. This feature allows you to follow a series of steps, starting with selecting the impairment and then selecting the limitation associated with that impairment for the specific individual you're looking to assist. The next step would then allow you to choose job functions that may be difficult for the individual. And from there, you would go on to the next step where you would find a list of accommodations to consider. Options for products may be listed here as well. You can simply click on products and find information about those items and the vendors where they may be purchased. The A to Z tab organizes the information and materials you need in an easy alphabetized format. And this is probably something that you would probably use the most. It's probably what we use the most here at JAN. You can find listings of specific disabilities and medical conditions ranging from Addison's disease and brain injuries to vision impairments, topics ranging from accommodations to job descriptions and job coaches to web accessibility, and limitations that vary from anger and emotions to memory and organization to stress and tolerance. Also see the training hub in the red box at the bottom right corner. Here you can access over 50 archived webcasts spanning 5 years. Expand your knowledge with topics such as disability etiquette, assistive technologies, management techniques, and the latest on accommodations and employment provisions of the ADA. You can download accessible transcripts as well as coordinating handouts. Other training resources include our just-in-time modules. These materials may be used in group training or by individuals. They may also be easily incorporated into larger training events. Some resources are for general audiences and some are quite specific. Survey the wide variety of topics and find one or more that you might be interested in. Topics include all about Jan, understanding and applying the ADA, the interactive process, assistive technology in the workplace, accommodations for PTSD, and also accommodations for brain injury. All right, and here's just a recap a little bit of what is on our website. It's pretty comprehensive. You'll find over 200 publications, as well as SOAR, the Searchable Online Accommodation Resource that I just talked a bit about. You'll find our ADA library and the A to Z of disabilities and accommodations. Our Jan on Demand may be the best way to send an email inquiry. We have those for both the ADA workplace issues as well as for self-employment and starting your own business. Here you'll find a form that asks specific questions about the job, the difficulties the individual's having, and the disability involved. This information aids us in providing you with the appropriate information. I remember an email I got years ago that simply stated, I'm having problems at work, can you help me? It's difficult to know what resources will be helpful without a clear idea of what the issues are. This email format helps the person getting in contact with Jan the opportunity to provide as much information as possible so that we can provide a thorough and appropriate response. See also our wide selection of publications available in Spanish, our Jan updates, and check out our live Jan chat feature that has become more and more popular. And also you can see all the ways that you can connect with Jan through social networks. So now we're going to talk about disclosure. That can be a tricky part. I had several calls just this morning on disclosure. How do I disclose? Several of them were, two of them actually were older individuals who had just been diagnosed and were just not sure what they needed to do. So disclosure is the sharing of personal information about a disability. When disclosing as part of an accommodation request, it's important to provide information about the nature of the disability, the limitations involved, and why the accommodation being requested is needed. We'll explain a few things here to help make your disclosure a bit easier. Okay, there are several reasons why someone with a disability may choose to disclose that disability to their employer. The first and probably foremost reason would be to ask for job accommodation. The employer has a right to know if a disability is involved when the employee asks for accommodation. The next reason to disclose might be to receive benefits or privileges of employment. The ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations so that employees with disabilities can enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment equal to those enjoyed by similarly situated employees without disabilities. Benefits and privileges of employment include, but are not limited to, employer-sponsored training, access to cafeterias, lounges, gymnasiums, auditoriums, transportation, and parties or other social functions. If an employee with a disability needs a reasonable accommodation in order to gain access to and have an equal opportunity to participate in these benefits and privileges, then the employer must provide the accommodation unless it can show undue hardship. An example of this might be in a school where a public address system is used to make announcements. In order to make this information accessible to a deaf employee, the principal arranges to send in advance an electronic mail message to the deaf employee conveying the information that will be broadcast. The third reason an individual would want to disclose a disability is to explain an unusual circumstance. For instance, someone with temperature regulation difficulties due to a brain injury may want to explain to his or her employer that it would be helpful to work from home while the office air conditioner is being repaired. Disclosure can be very simple. You can tell your employer that you need to speak to him or her about an adjustment or change that is needed for a reason related to a medical condition. Jan recommends that you put that in writing. If you have a verbal conversation with your employer, you can easily follow it up in writing. You may use plain English to request an accommodation. You do not have to mention the ADA, nor do you need to use the phrase reasonable accommodation. It can be as easy as saying to your supervisor, I need to talk to you about a problem I'm having with getting to work on time because of a medical condition. Again, either verbally or in writing, you can tell your employer, your supervisor, an HR representative, a union steward, or other appropriate person that you need an accommodation or change in the workplace. The ADA does not require that you speak to a specific person. So if you feel more comfortable disclosing to HR rather than a supervisor or vice versa, you can go to the one you feel more comfortable approaching. Although supervisors and managers may need to be involved in the interactive process to help with the accommodations piece, they are not generally entitled to know an employee's specific medical information. And here we have an example. A veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, had difficulty focusing while trying to multitask due to sleep problems. He also experienced mood swings and lost his temper several times at work. He had not been disciplined for the outbursts, but decided it was time to disclose his disability and ask for accommodations. Because the optimal time for disclosing a disability and asking for an accommodation is before problems at work become too far advanced, a consultant at Jan provided technical assistance on how to disclose a disability and write an accommodation request letter. Okay, now we're going to look at some common accommodation options that may be helpful. All right, first we're going to talk about the purchase of equipment or modifications to existing equipment may be an effective accommodation for people with many types of disabilities. Many forms of assistive technology make it possible for people to overcome existing barriers to performing functions of a job. These devices range from very simple and inexpensive solutions, such as an elastic band that can enable a person to hold a pencil and write, to high-tech electronic equipment that can be operated with eye or head movements by people who cannot use their hands. There are also many ways to modify standard equipment that can help enable people with different functional limitations to perform jobs effectively and safely. Jan can help you find a product that works for you. Consider the following ideas. Task lighting is often used for those who are sensitive to the overhead lighting. A watch that can be set to vibrate or alarm can be helpful to those who need reminders. A smart pen records as you write, so it's an excellent tool to help capture the best notes. A pocket recorder can be useful to those who may need to listen to verbal instructions repeatedly. A wireless headset can alleviate the physical stress and pain that may come with answering the phone, especially while taking notes or using the computer at the same time. And lastly, an iPad, along with apps, can be useful for training, note-taking, and recording, as well as assistance with organization and concentration. Our next example here involves an electrician's helper with PTSD who needed to attend periodic licensure trainings. He had difficulty taking effective notes and remembering information in the meeting. As an accommodation, the employee was provided an iPad with apps that would record the training. This enabled him to listen to the trainings as many times as he needed. He was also provided training on how to use the device and the apps, and that can be very important. I remember an example where the person had asked for an iPad, and they came to work one morning and it was on their desk. They'd never used anything like that before, and so they were kind of lost at what to do. So training can be very helpful. Here we have another example that involves a public policy administrator who worked from home and who had difficulty remembering who was on conference calls, who was speaking, and what questions were being directed to him. The administrator was accommodated with a meeting application on his computer that had a chat function where questions could be typed into the screen for him to read. He was able to understand the questions better when reading them for himself several times if necessary. He would also be able to see the names of the persons asking the question. Employers are required to modify the worksite to meet the needs of an employee with a disability that needs an accommodation. Although the requirement for accessibility in employment is triggered by the needs of a particular individual, employers should consider initiating changes that will provide general accessibility. Parking may be included in making the worksite accessible. We have examples of possible accommodations here on the slide. They include parking, a doorway or threshold ramp to ease access to rooms, especially if the thresholds are raised. We also have a picture of an automatic door opener that can be helpful for those who cannot open traditional doors. As an example here, we have an office worker who is having difficulty with balance and coordination and walking steadily due to a brain injury. The employer had observed her falling a couple of times on the way to the printer and fax room and also the restroom. As an accommodation, the employer provided handrails to and from the employee's workspace and the common areas, her own printer and fax, and then changed her workstation setup so that she could access files and other materials and equipment without having to move around too much. Here we have another example. A prep cook with paraplegia was hired to work in a large kitchen with stand-up workstation. As an accommodation, the employer purchased a stand-up wheelchair so the cook could work at a standing height. Job restructuring or job modification is a form of reasonable accommodation which enables many qualified individuals with disabilities to perform jobs effectively. Job restructuring as a reasonable accommodation may involve reallocating or redistributing the marginal functions of a job. However, an employer is not required to reallocate essential functions of a position as a reasonable accommodation. Essential functions, by definition, are those that a qualified individual must perform with or without an accommodation. Job restructuring may be accomplished by exchanging marginal functions of a job that cannot be performed by a person with a disability for marginal job functions performed by one or more other employees. Although an employer is not required to reallocate essential job functions, it may be a reasonable accommodation to modify the essential functions of a job by changing when or how they're done. Contact us if you have questions about whether job restructuring may be an appropriate option for an employee with a disability. Our next example involves an employer who required all employees to work overtime. An employee with PTSD asked to be excused from overtime because of fatigue and exacerbation of symptoms. So what was the accommodation provided here? None, actually. The employer denied the request, stating that overtime is an essential function and did not have to be removed. To show you another example of job restructuring, we have here an employee with seizures who was a member of a cleaning crew and was restricted from working on a ladder. He could perform all of the functions of his job except for the task of maintaining the overhead lighting fixtures. The job tasks of a second crew member included cleaning a small kitchen in the employee's lounge, which is a task the first crew member could perform. As an accommodation, the employer switched these specific tasks performed by the two crew members. All right, modifying schedules and allowing leave time. An employer should consider modifying a work schedule as a reasonable accommodation unless this would cause an undue hardship. Modified work schedules may include flexibility in work hours, including arrival and departure times, lunch and break schedules, the structure of the work week, or part-time work. Many people with disabilities are fully qualified to perform jobs with the accommodation of a modified work schedule. Some people are unable to work a standard 9-to-5 workday or a standard Monday to Friday work week, or others need some adjustment to regular schedules. People with disabilities may need modified work schedules for required medical treatments, rest periods to deal with fatigue, and adjusted starting times for difficulties with public transportation, including paratransit schedules, or if perhaps people take medication to sleep and then have difficulty getting up in the morning. Flexible leave policies should also be considered as a reasonable accommodation when employees require time off from work because of their disability. An employer is not required to provide additional paid leave as an accommodation, but should consider allowing the use of accrued leave, advanced leave, or leave without pay. Our next example is a court employee who was having difficulty with emotions after returning to work following a traumatic brain injury. She was diagnosed with pseudobulbar effect, or PBA, where she would have outbursts of uncontrollable laughter at seemingly inappropriate times. The employee asked that her coworkers be educated on PBA so they would understand what was going on with her. She was accommodated with extra breaks to help manage her stress, a temporary lightening of her workload, and a flexible schedule for counseling and doctor's appointments. In this example, a veteran with bipolar disorder and PTSD had issues with her medication and needed occasional time off from work, approximately half a day, in order to take care of her medical appointments. The employee had been on the job for 7 months and had used her accrued time. She was accommodated with unpaid intermittent leave under the ADA. Okay, now we're going to talk about modifying policies. Modifying a workplace policy may be another effective accommodation. While employers are free to set policies, there are some policies that may need to be modified for an employee with a disability. Examples of policies that employers might have to consider modifying include dress codes, rules about eating or drinking at a workstation, attendance policies, and rules about animals in the workplace. In this example, a file clerk with an anxiety disorder uses a service animal to help her deal with stress in the workplace. For the accommodation, the employer modified its no animal policy and allowed the service dog in the workplace. Interpreters and readers are other forms of accommodations under the ADA. Readers are often used for people with low vision or no vision, or individuals who experience difficulty reading. Providing a reader for someone with reading and print difficulties may be considered a reasonable accommodation, depending on the extent of the reading that would be required. The reader must read well enough to enable the employee to perform his or her job effectively. Oftentimes, a reader is used in testing situations. The job of a reader in a testing situation is to simply read the test or material. There's no defining words or explaining terms. An employer may also be required to provide interpreters. If an individual with a disability is otherwise qualified to perform essential job functions, the employer's basic obligation is to provide an accommodation that will enable this person to perform the job effectively. So providing an interpreter on an as-needed basis may be a reasonable accommodation for a person who is deaf in some employment situations, barring undue hardship. And let me just define that. I think I've talked about that several times and really didn't give you a definition of undue hardship. What that means is an accommodation that would be considered too expensive or too disruptive, or one that would change the nature of the business. Okay, so let me mention job coaches here. Job coaches can also be part of an effective accommodation, particularly in supported or customized employment situations where assistance in job training may be needed. Jan can help by discussing where to find readers, interpreters, and job coaches, when employers have an obligation to provide them, and when alternative methods of communication might be appropriate. Here we have an example where a veteran who recently returned to the workforce after spending several years overseas has post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, which causes difficulty with memory and mood regulation. He was recently hired as a customer service representative. After disclosing his disability and requesting reasonable accommodations, his employer provided him with a cubicle close to an exit with his back facing a wall. This helped to alleviate some of his stress, but he still had difficulty with memory and emotional outbursts. As an accommodation, the employer obtained a job coach through the Department of Veterans Affairs to assist the employee with adjusting to his new position. The job coach worked with the employer and employee to develop a customized form for taking notes from customers and a system for organizing the employee's workspace. The job coach also suggested the employee email his supervisor when he had questions so that he will have responses in written form that he could refer back to later if he forgets something. Finally, the job coach helped the employee incorporate breaks into his day to walk and do breathing exercises that would help reduce the likelihood of emotional outbursts. After the job coach came in twice a week for 3 weeks, the employee was able to incorporate the job coach's suggestions into his regular routine and perform his job duties without assistance. Okay, and here we have reassignment. A reassignment is generally looked at as an accommodation of last resort, meaning it should be considered only when an accommodation is not possible in the employee's present job or when an accommodation in the employee's present job would cause an undue hardship. But it may also be appropriate as a reasonable accommodation if both the employer and the employee agree that it is more suitable than accommodations in the present job. What this means is that the employer looks at the open positions the employee is qualified for. An employer does not have to create a position, nor do they have to bump someone else out of their position. The position should be as close as possible to the current one in terms of status and pay, but if that's not possible, the employer may also consider lower positions. And here we have a great example. Here's an RN with nearly 20 years of experience in a veterans hospital who was having great difficulty working in the emergency and critical care units due to an increase in symptoms when dealing with trauma. He asked for the accommodation of a reassignment. For the accommodation, the Hospital Human Resources Department worked with the employee to determine which positions he was qualified for that were open or would be open soon. Together they ranked the positions in the order of which were best suited to the employee. At the end of this process, the nurse was able to choose among 3 different open positions that he was qualified for in the Veterans Healthcare System. Here we have another example of reassignment. A veteran delivering lunches to the homebound asked for an accommodation of a temporary change in position while the prep kitchen was being remodeled. The temporary kitchen was located in the city where he would be required to drive through a tunnel under several overpasses and handle more traffic than he was able to. The veteran was accommodated with a temporary reassignment to a painting and light construction crew that was helping with the renovations at the original kitchen until that work was completed. Since he would only be required to drive to the center where the kitchen was located, the driver accepted the reassignment as an accommodation and was able to continue working with no problem. Okay, so here we wanted to share information with you from our self-employment team. Our self-employment team provides individualized consulting, resource materials, and referrals based on specific needs and goals. They provide ongoing electronic and telephone access and support. Jan has a self-employment and entrepreneurship website with an extensive number and variety of publications. Jan also provides information on micro-enterprise, home-based businesses, independent contracting, and customized self-employment. And our self-employment team can assist individuals with all types of disabilities. Jan can also provide information on entrepreneurship programs for veterans with disabilities, feasibility and idea development, business planning, low-cost marketing strategies, business legal structure options, benefits planning, financing options including asset development, health and business insurance information, tax issues including tax credits, and mentorship and coaching. And here we have an example of a caller who needed assistance. Carol had both a mobility impairment and cognitive issues. She was interested in security and emergency management consulting. Carol had served in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and was interested in government contracting at both the federal and state levels. She had a strong network of contacts and had questions about business organization, financing, and marketing. Jan was able to provide Carol with resources for both a woman-owned and a veteran-owned business. We do work cooperatively at Jan to help with all of our callers. So with Carol, our self-employment and our cognitive teams work together in helping answer the questions Carol had about accommodations she needed in a home office. Okay, this concludes our presentation on using Jan. We hope you found it helpful. If you need more information on workplace accommodations, please feel free to contact us at Jan. You can reach us toll-free at 800-526-7234 for voice or 877-781-9403 for TTY, or visit us on the web at askjan.org. You can also contact us through Skype and text and find us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and other social networks. We hope to talk to you soon, and again, thank you for making Jan a part of your training program. Are there any questions that I can answer for you at this time?
Okay, thank you so much for that presentation, Melanie. I'm sure on behalf of all the attendees today, they appreciate all of that really rich information. I just want to point out that right now we have the slide up on NVTAC contact information also if anyone needs that. And I'll jump to a few questions we've received in just a second. To people who joined the webinar maybe a little later, just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive an email with the recording, the PowerPoint slides, where you can access all that information again in the post-webinar survey. So right now I'm going to look at one of our questions. So Melanie, what would you say to a veteran who is reluctant to disclose a disability and maybe trying to inform them that they're qualified for a job and then also could get these accommodations, or maybe could get accommodations for a job they already have? So what would you say to reluctance coming from a veteran with a disability?
Well, I would say, you know, depending on how reluctant somebody is and how much they need an accommodation. A lot of people will try to accommodate themselves and can be successful to a point. Maybe sometimes the disability changes or the job changes. And so a lot of times they can accommodate themselves and do the job without letting the employer know. But once their production or performance issues come up, or conduct issues that are related to the disability, then it's probably time to disclose. And once the employee gets into any kind of counseling situations or you know, write-ups or anything like that, they would want to disclose that disability. And you know, if you don't want to give your specific diagnosis. Sometimes people with PTSD, bipolar disorder, certain things, they don't want to give that information to the employer. And so they can start out a little broader. You might just ask for help and say, I'm having some difficulty with these tasks. Some employers will provide accommodations without asking medical questions, and you know, if you have an employer that's willing to do that, that's great. Sometimes employers will do that specifically for accommodations that aren't as expensive or ones that are easy to provide. And then if accommodations become more specific and expensive, then they'll ask for medical information. But you could give more general medical information, such as saying, I have a mental health impairment, and that doesn't give away the diagnosis. What's really most important is the limitations that are involved, not the diagnosis. You know, 3 or 4 people could have the same diagnosis and really have different limitations, and depending on what the job is. And so what's really important is to discuss with your employer the limitations you're having. What is it about the job that's difficult for you to do? And relate that to your disability. And if you have ideas on what you can do to help, what might be successful, things that have worked in the past, then that helps the employer look at, okay, you know, that makes sense to me. If you know it's worked in the past, they may be more willing to try that. Doesn't mean you can't try something new and say, hey, I really think this will work. Sometimes employers are willing to provide temporary accommodations or trial accommodations. If we're not sure if this is going to work, hey, let's try it for a specified amount of time and then come back together and talk about was that successful or not.
Thank you very much. I just got another question. So say a veteran is in recovery and attends AA meetings. Would it be a reasonable accommodation for them to have a flexible work schedule to attend those meetings?
Yes, absolutely. It could be, depending on the job and depending on when those meetings are, absolutely. A flexible schedule could work. If it's not feasible in certain jobs to have that flexibility, maybe the time could be made up some other way, or they could get either paid leave. If they have no paid leave, they could use that as unpaid leave. But there are jobs where employers will say, well, we can't have an employee working past a certain time because we don't have supervisors here. You know, if it's something like that, sometimes the schedule could be rearranged where the lunchtime is combined with the trip to the meeting so that the person doesn't miss as much. Or if the meeting's first thing in the morning or like last thing at the end of the day, where the employee wouldn't need to have as much time off, you know, for travel back and forth. But that's absolutely an accommodation that could be requested.
And does the ADA and accommodations, do they apply to caregivers of individuals with disabilities?
No, they do not. Now there's FMLA, which is federal leave, and that can apply to caregivers if it's a family member. You know, under the ADA, an employer can't hold it against an employee or discriminate against an employee because they have a family member that has a disability or needs care, but they don't have to accommodate that person. The accommodations are for the person with the disability.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying there too. What would you say to an employer? A lot of the grantees that we work with do a lot of job development and talk to employers. So what might you say to someone who's hesitant to hire a veteran because they're concerned about maybe undiagnosed PTSD and traumatic brain injuries and how those conditions might affect employee performance and just overall morale?
Well, I think, you know, there are lots of disabilities that could be considered hidden, and any employer hiring anybody could hire somebody that has a learning disability, a mental health condition, a brain injury, if, you know, that they're not visible. And so employers, I guess, are kind of taking a chance on anybody they hire. But I think it's really important for employers to look at giving a veteran a chance, looking at their past experience and what they're able to do. You know, you can't really, an employer shouldn't be trying to second guess, oh, well, wait a minute, because like I said before, anybody you hire could develop a disability or have a hidden disability that the employer doesn't know about. And it's really good for morale. It's really good for the workplace to have a diverse number of employees. I think when the employees see that an employer is hiring somebody with a disability and accommodating them, it makes for a better workplace. It makes people more willing to disclose their own disabilities. And, you know, there are a lot of talented, valuable employees with disabilities, and employers should really be working to retain those employees and also hire those employees that have that experience.
Thank you very much again, Melanie. I have a question in a slightly different direction. Are there any subsidies, tax breaks, grants, or other compensation that employers can access to help pay for accommodation?
Yes, there are. And if somebody has a specific request about that, they can certainly call or email us and we can get that information to them.
Okay. Yeah, that was leading into the second question. So people can contact Jan directly if they have a veteran they're working with who might need to figure out an accommodation, correct?
Yes. Anybody can call. The veteran themselves can call, a parent, a spouse, a service provider, the employer, whoever. Kids will call for their parents too sometimes.
And what about somebody who's, like someone calling on behalf of somebody else, a direct service provider perhaps, who is explaining job accommodations to both the veteran receiving services and the potential employer? Do you just have a kind of a wrap-up thing you would say to each of those people?
Yes. We also do conference calls, if that might be helpful, where you can get several people on the line at one time. A lot of people find that helpful because then everybody's on the same call, hearing the same information, and then hopefully is on the same page. But we have specific information for employers. We have specific information and publications for employees as well. And it's just, you know, just has a little different aspect to it. But we can send that information out. We can certainly talk about it individually, or like I said, we can talk about it as a conference call.
Great, thank you. What do you think the most important thing that the public should know about job accommodation?
Well, I think it's important to know that there are lots of people, and I don't have statistics right now, who need accommodations. Not all accommodations are expensive. A lot of accommodations involve adjusting a schedule. Sometimes people need more breaks of fewer duration, or they like combine their lunch and their break time to have a longer lunch because they need to have a rest period or a nap, or they need to do something to de-stress themselves. There are lots of accommodations that are not going to be costly and that can be implemented pretty quickly. And like I said earlier, a lot of people have been used to accommodating themselves, and so they really know what their disabilities are, they know what their limitations are, they know what is good to help them, and that's really helpful when they go to talk to an employer. The more you know yourself and you know what you need, the more you can convince your employer. But it's not really a issue of convincing the employer. I mean, it's your right to ask for accommodations and the employer to provide those that don't cause a hardship. And even if you don't know what you need, that's perfectly fine too, because it's really up to the employer to provide those ideas. You know yourself, you know your disability, you know what you're having difficulty with, but the employer knows the job, or should know the job. A supervisor may be involved with the accommodation because they know the job. They may see you working and say, okay, you know, this is what we've observed, this is what we think can help. But I think that the important thing is that most accommodations that are costly cost under $500. A lot of them can be provided quickly and inexpensively, and a lot of the accommodations can really help somebody work more effectively.
If somebody is going to contact you all doing your wonderful work at Jan, should they expect to have any costs associated with reaching out to Jan for help with those job accommodations?
No, absolutely not. Our services are free. You know, if you call once, if you call 10 times, we have employers that we call frequent flyers because they call frequently. They have a lot of employees. They have a lot of good questions, and we welcome the questions, and no, there's absolutely no cost involved. We do not provide products. We can provide information on the products, but there's no cost involved in the consultation, no.
So that looks like all the questions that we received. We are running a little ahead of schedule, so hopefully that puts everyone on good track with the rest of their busy days. So Melanie, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say in closing for the webinar?
No, the only thing I have to say is if you're like me, you'll think of a question, you know, later on your drive home or in the middle of the night or something. And if questions come up, please feel free to get in contact with us. You can ask for me, or, you know, you can call and just say what your question is and what your issue is, and they will get you to the proper person. You know, like I talked in the beginning, there are different teams that work with different disabilities and have different specialties, so they're really specialists in different areas. So, no, the only thing is if you have questions at any time, please feel free to contact us.
Okay. So yeah, and again, the contact information and the slides will all be sent out after this. Melanie, I'd just like to thank you so much for being with us today, and all of our attendees and the work you do on behalf of veterans.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.